Good evening. Welcome to the General Society and to the season start of the Landmark Lectures. We're delighted that you could be here this evening. The Labour, Literature and Landmark Lectures are supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. We are very pleased to present this series of landmark lectures in partnership with the New York Landmarks Conservancy, and I'd like to express our appreciation for their help and support. For those of you who may be less familiar with the General Society, and in fact, can I ask, are many of you here for the first time? Okay, great. Well, a welcome to you, and of course, welcome to our returnees. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York is a non-profitable organization that was founded in 1785 by the skilled craftsmen of New York City. Today, our 234-year-old organization continues to serve the people of the City of New York through our educational and cultural programs. These include our John M. Mossman lot collection, which you can see upstairs, and you're welcome to visit after tonight's program. The library, of which, of course, you're in, and if you're interested in library membership, you will find information on the front table. Our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, and, of course, the lecture series. Our lecture series is now nearly 200 years old. You will also find an informational postcard on your seat that will give you some additional background information on the General Society. The 2019 Landmark Lecture Series is curated by Lisa Easton, a partner in the New York City-based architecture and historic preservation firm, Easton Architects. And in fact, Lisa, time goes by so fast, but Lisa now we've had the honor of Lisa curating the series for 6 years now. So, to introduce tonight's speaker, I'm now very pleased to introduce to you Lisa Easton.
Thank you, Karen. And Victoria, our executive director, is here. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. The preservation of historic places is more important than retaining a physical landmark. There is an emotional connection with these important places that provides people with a sense of continuity, providing a connection to the past that helps one ground themselves in the present. In a rapidly changing world, historic places provide people with a feeling of being part of a continuum. Preservation as an ideal gives us a sense of orientation to our society, using structures and objects of the past to establish values linked to time and place. This time and place is defined by the traditions that envelop it, the values people hold, and the cultural heritage it represents, provides stability. Preservation is not about being nostalgic. It's about living in a better present, that we are part of a broader reach that connects eras, creates continuity, and embraces a more cumulative whole. I am honored to be a part of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen's 2019, tongue twister, Labor, Literature, and Landmark Lecture Series. And when asked to curate this 4-part landmark series, I wanted to bring together a group of individuals whose experience captures the essence of preserving our treasured landmarks, from technology of materials and methodology to advocacy and historic research. Tonight, I am honored to introduce our first lecturer in the series, Janet W. Foster. Ms. Foster is an architectural historian and historic preservation consultant with over 30 years of experience, particularly with vernacular buildings in New Jersey and New York area. She studied at the Columbia University Historic Preservation Program and then founded Acroterion, a preservation consulting firm, in 1983. Ms. Foster helped to develop the curriculum at the Drew University Continuing Education Program Historic Preservation, which was successful from 2002 to 2012. And she was part of the Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation as the Associate Director for the Urban Planning and Historic Preservation Programs. She continues as an association with Columbia University as an adjunct professor in the Historic Preservation Program, teaching American architectural history. Janet also serves, in her spare time, on the Historic Preservation Commission in Madison, New Jersey, the town in which she lives. She is also on the New Jersey State Review Board, and she chairs the board of the New Jersey Historic Trust. So tonight it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Janet Foster.
Thank you so much. A pleasure to see so many familiar faces, and I hope if we're not, we get to know each other by the end of the evening. Labor, Literature, and Landmarks was presented as the theme when Lisa asked me, could you maybe give a talk? And I thought for a very brief moment and said, you know what? My specialty, pattern books, fits exactly in that wheelhouse. We have to go back to look at how buildings were made in pre-industrial, pre-19th century United States, when of course it was a handmade production with a craft tradition passed down through apprenticeships, through communal work. Throughout this region, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, we see examples of vernacular architecture that represent the traditions, the craft traditions of several different settlement groups that came to this area in the 17th and 18th century. English from urban places, English people who migrated down out of New England, German settlers, Dutch settlers, and even Swedes who did colonize in New Jersey and brought us log structures. The communal, vernacular, traditional building work that was done in that time, the labor of it was directed by craftsmen who had gone through an apprentice program, but who were supported by an entire community. Early architecture was a cultural idea within a community, and everyone needed the muscle power or to support it by bringing food. When buildings were erected, it was very much a communal activity, and people knew going into this kind of how things would go together and what it would look like. The story of pattern books is how that falls apart and changes to our modern way of building. And one of the instigators of that is a long time ago is Palladio, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Italian architect, mason, builder, Andrea Palladio, who's really credited as being the first to write down in book form how to make a building. He's writing it. He changes the game. It's no longer master to apprentice. It's written down. The book is from the late 16th century. Its first translation into English, though, in a full 4-volume set, does not happen until 1738. It's known as the Ware edition. It's the Italian Renaissance coming to England 150 years late. Maybe not late, but there is certainly a communications gap, shall we say. Palladio was reusing the classical language of architecture, the language primarily of the Romans, the language of the classical orders. But he's also showing an inventiveness that you use classical designs and reuse them and mix them up and put them together to create new buildings. Now, Palladio was an architect of very fine church buildings and villas for very wealthy. He's building for a very elite segment, particularly in and around Venice. But he's using a vocabulary that is more Roman in its origins and showing that symmetry, or the use of the orders, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian columns, by that I mean, combined with inventiveness can create a whole new kind of architecture. And so that comes to the New World, again with a time lapse. But for instance, Drayton Hall in South Carolina dominates the landscape, and you'll see that that has quite a bit of reference to the Palladian ideal. Drayton Hall no longer has its appendages. When it was built, it had flanking wings, and they are known archaeologically, but they no longer stand. And it may be fitting that we begin our talk about pattern books, about literary sources, in a library and about a library. This is the Redwood Library in Newport, Rhode Island, from 1747. And it is based very clearly on a design drawing done in a 1735 edition, the 1735 edition of Palladio, published by Ware. His illustrator is actually known, a guy named Hoppus, Edward Hoppus. So we say that the Redwood Library was designed by Peter Harrison. Peter Harrison was a very good reader. He had his hands on some very nice English pattern books, but he's putting together the pieces of other designs, or in this case, copying pretty wholeheartedly, in order to create a temple of learning, which seemed to be the appropriate setting for a library. The Redwood Library claims to be the oldest circulating library in the United States, still in its original home. The Philadelphia Library, founded by Ben Franklin, is older, but it's moved buildings a couple of times. So Redwood Library gets that particular prize. But a lovely, symmetrical, classical composition from 1747, which puts it pretty squarely in what we would describe as the Georgian period. You can see how the Hoppus drawing goes back to Palladio. Santa Maria Maggiore on the water in Venice is Palladio's own design. The illustration in the upper left is one illustration of that, which appeared in an English book in the early 18th century, and clearly Hoppus simplifies that in order to get the essence of the idea across. And it's from that a little wooden building in Newport is created. Palladio's influence on English architecture continues strongly through the 18th century and is very much underpinning what we might call the Georgian period, the Georgian style. Georgian ain't a style, okay? It's a time period when the Georges were on the throne, 1, 2, 3, and 4, from 1714 to 1830. Just as later, Victorian is not a style. It's a time period when she rules from what is it, 1838, fans of the show will know this, to 1902. But both of the Georgian and Victorian cover a lot of different kind of territory in architecture, and so we use it as a temporal description, not as a stylistic. But technically, the 18th century is very much about Palladian classical influence, and that's become, in sort of common language, a Georgian. James Gibbs, I call him Jamie because I feel I know his work so well, Book of Architecture from 1727. He's an English designer who took Palladio's work and made his own country houses. And there's a drawing of one of his country houses, and then two of his American offspring. James Gibbs, I assure you, never went to Philadelphia. He would have been appalled at the idea of going to Philadelphia instead of building country houses outside of London. But his book did go, and these 18th century books of builders' ideas, particularly Palladian ideas, were generally large, expensive, but some of them did make it to the American colonies where wealthy merchants used them and had them as an influence for their homes. One not too far from here, Morristown National Historic Park in New Jersey, is the home of Jacob Ford. He was an iron master. He owned iron mines in northern New Jersey. His home is restored in a park because George Washington did sleep there. It's about 30 miles west of Manhattan, which really is in the hills, in the woods. It's kind of the middle of the nowhere for 1776 when it's built, and yet it has this remarkable original, what we would describe as a Palladian window door treatment at the facade. How in the world did some carpenter in Morristown, New Jersey in the 1770s have a clue about a Palladian arch arrangement? Through a book, obviously. Batty Langley, one of the more memorable names of architects and designers. It's an English builder who went into writing about building in the 18th century, produced a number of books, including The City and Country Builder's Treasury, where he shows things like what he described as a Venetian window, a tribute to Palladio, the three-part composition, which was clearly enough to inspire a craftsman, unknown, anonymous craftsman, to build a pretty credible door enframement. One of the things about the 18th and early 19th century pattern book is you have to understand this is still overlaid on that early craft building tradition. This is a heavy timber framed house. It is people who are learning by a trade route, by apprenticeship. There are not a lot of nails. Everything is pegged together. In order to make the planes, to make the molds for this, you have to make the shapes, make the planes yourself. So it is very much a handmade craft tradition, and without the grounding that they have in that vernacular tradition, I don't think you could make. I mean, if you don't really know what you're doing, you can't look at that picture and come up with that door enframement, I think. So it's both a testament to the power of words and drawings to transcend time and place, and also the skill set that comes with really knowing a craft well and adapting to new ideas. George Washington used the exact same window treatment in his house. Probably he had his slaves build that for him, but there we can see an interior and an exterior view. He just gets the pediment added on top, a little fancier version, but comes from the same pattern book source. After George Washington had helped the United States win the war, we are now in a period where the United States is trying to do everything they can to become independent, to have their own arts and culture and industry. And so in Massachusetts, a man named Asher Benjamin, who is a trained carpenter, traditionally trained carpenter, but who has worked in Boston and seen some more sophisticated designs, decides that what's really needed is a way for builders and workmen who are outside of the urban areas to understand and know how to make these kind of buildings. So Asher Benjamin publishes a book with very simple, almost crude drawings called The Country Builder's Assistant in 1797, and that becomes the first American-produced pattern book. He publishes out of Boston. Asher Benjamin worked in the Connecticut River Valley and Boston area. And later he discovered that actually publishing was his forte, and he ended up writing 4 different books, which went to multiple editions. He died a rather wealthy man in 1845 with an estate of about $18,000, almost all of which comes from publishing royalties, which is a pretty enviable situation for any author, rather than his own building work. The illustration at the bottom, the Ionic order, is from one of his later books when he picks up on the Greek Revival style. The Greek Revival, as you know, is using the architecture of ancient Greece more than ancient Rome as an inspiration. The Bank of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia may be one of the first Greek Revival style buildings erected in this country. It was designed by Benjamin Henry Latrobe, an English-trained architect who was brought to this country pretty much on the urging of Thomas Jefferson, a man who knew quite a thing or two about architecture. Sadly, the building was demolished by 1860, but it's a remarkable piece of classical architecture with its pedimented front, which would become a signature of the Greek Revival style. What is notable about this is it is a full masonry building. It has the domed structure, it has cut stone. This is in Philadelphia, which at that time is the wealthiest city in what would be the emerging United States. Masonry construction was not well known, was not well used in this country. The craftsmen were not here. The ability to quarry and then transport stone when you have not very good roads and no canals and not a lot of access. The skill set to lay it all up is very, very limited outside of the major cities. So this was a remarkable building, not only for its stylistic advance, but also for being a pretty sophisticated example of full-on masonry construction. The Greek Revival becomes a very popular style in the United States into the 1830s, mostly through the pattern book work of a guy named Menard Lefevre. Menard Lefevre, interesting, was born in Morristown, New Jersey, the town with Jacob Ford's house and the Palladian door enframement, but learned his trade in New York and ended up building a great swath of what we would call the Brooklyn Heights Historic District. He was a commercial builder in the 1830s or so, and he too turned his hand to taking what was a popular urban style and making it accessible to his fellow craftsmen and workmen. One of his early books, The Modern Builder's Guide, and you'll see a lot of these pattern books now begin to use the word modern. They're emphasizing that they're using au courant design. Lefevre, one of Lefevre's great innovative tricks is he's saying, you know what, as a country builder, you're building in wood, I know this. I know you have no idea and no capacity how to make a turned column with an ionic column or with an ionic capital. How in the world do you do this? He shows a way of drawing it that simplifies it to the extent that the columns become square section pillars. The temple front, the pediment front is still there, very pronounced, but a lot of the other detail becomes just boards, a board for a fascia, another board for a setback for an entablature. Very simplified, which makes it very modern from our standpoint, but also very accessible. And so that there is a wonderful quote when the United States was young, and somebody comes up the Hudson River and is remarking on all the little temples they could see from the bank along the banks of the Hudson River, and realized, oh, they're houses. They're temple front houses. There weren't actually temples up the Hudson River. So it became a very popular style, and really one of the first to travel from the seaboard rim of the United States into the interior, so that, for instance, the Ohio State Capitol is a wonderful Greek Revival style building. The Tennessee State Capitol is a wonderful Greek Revival style building. This is the first style that really moves west. Interesting, Lefevre's pattern book called The Beauties of Modern Architecture was used very literally to create the interiors of the governor's mansion in Mississippi in 1841. And here's some details that document how that was copied. So that Lefevre's quite simple illustrations for I won't say dumbed down, but a very simplified version of Greek Revival end up being amplified in quite elegant style. Lefevre also built in the Gothic Revival style. He's more known for his work in Greek Revival, but Gothic Revival is the parallel trend of the 1830s, 40s, 50s that speaks to a Romantic Revival interest in the past, in just as the world is becoming more industrial, how about if we look to architecture that is from a pre-industrial world? There's also the sense at this time of Gothic being something that projected, quote, Christian morality, and mostly picturesque design. Those wonderful, spiky, those wonderful, spiky pinnacles coming up the side of the church. This is St. Anne and the Holy Trinity in Brooklyn Heights, part of the historic district there. It's a notable church for its early and important stained glass windows inside, but it's Menard Lefevre who designed and apparently built the structure or oversaw the building of this important masonry Gothic Revival building. The Gothic Revival, though, is indelibly associated with Alexander Jackson Davis. Davis is a draftsman here in New York, very talented, who became interested in architecture. He was the guy who said, here, I have an idea, here's a sketch, you draw it. And he drew it beautifully. He pretty soon got the idea, like, yeah, I can think of my own buildings, I don't need somebody to tell me what to draw, and becomes an architectural composer. There's no architecture school in the United States. He learns from other people at this time period. And those of you who know your history will recall that in 1837, when Davis is a young man in his early 30s, there's the Panic of 1837, maybe the first depression in the United States. And like all good architects, when times are tough, business slows, so they decide they'll publish something because if you can't build it, maybe you can publish it. So he puts together a book of illustrations of Romantic style, mainly Gothic, some Italianate, some Greek Revival style buildings, into a beautiful, beautiful book called Rural Residences. The plates would all be hand-colored. You can see the quality of the illustration. The whole book is very tiny. You know, it's 6 by 4, maybe. So that illustration is tiny, the size of your cell phone screen, but he didn't know that. But it's a beautifully done book, and it may be the greatest book never published, because it was so expensive to create these folios with these hand-colored illustrations. Folios were produced, and some libraries will have some copies of some parts of this book. It seems clear to me that an entire finished volume never actually hit the bookstands, because Davis had a wonderful imagination, was a beautiful draftsman, and he was not a good businessman. He couldn't make this go. But he did have commissions after the economy recovered. Particularly notable is his work at Llewellyn Park, which becomes the first planned suburban community in West Orange, New Jersey, and one might say the first gated community. The image at the lower left is the gate. It's still there. Big houses, Gothic Revival piles, like the house that was first known as Knoll, and then he has expanded later, becomes Lyndhurst in Tarrytown on the Hudson River, or the charming McKim Cottage in Llewellyn Park, which was actually the home of little Charlie Fallen McKim when he was a child. His parents had a beautiful Davis-designed Gothic cottage. Still, Davis has a very long career. He lived well through the 19th century, but he did country houses, he had rich clients, but he was never truly in demand until he met Andrew Jackson Downing, the other AJD. Alexander Jackson Downing was a self-taught son of a landscaper in Newburgh, New York. And Downing knew a lot about plants, was very, very intense correspondent with a lot of English landscape designers, and very interested in what was called the rural landscape movement, improving the homes, the farms, the roads, the villages of his fellow American countrymen. And Downing's great idea was, he says to his friend Alex one night, Alexander Jackson Davis, you know, you do some really great designs, but nobody appreciates them. I think we should do a book. And Davis saying, yeah, whatever. But Downing did. And he took Davis's designs with full permission, I'm sure, and said, let's put them in a book, let's call it Country Residences. And there you see, there you see a Davis design for the center-gabled Gothic cottage as it appears in Downing's book of 1842. Now, Downing's first book, actually, was Landscape Gardens, a treatise on the practice of landscape gardening in North America, et cetera, which is still available. Very important look at native plants and how to use them to create a picturesque English garden. Downing was as interested in the plants and has pages on how to trim a particular kind of fruit tree or where the best habitat might be for a particular kind of fern. Very knowledgeable, because as I say, he learned this from his father's knee. But he's also interested in the buildings that might go into such a landscape. And it's out of that his friendship with Davis really produces the work of country houses and later a book called The Architecture of Country Houses, of Residences. But interestingly enough, the literature part of this, not only are there books, Downing's work was picked up by a little publishing firm called Wiley, maybe impossible to see there. At the time, Wiley was an okay New York publishing firm. They had a couple of bestsellers from a guy named James Fenimore Cooper, and they had done some pretty good stuff with a guy named Washington Irving. But they picked up this kind of oddball thing, this hundreds pages long treatise on plants, and said, well, okay, we'll publish that. Proved to be an amazing bestseller and set Wiley on the path of forget the literature, we're going to go to scientific and academic publishing. Wiley is still in business, does books about architecture, scientific work. This is one that I just had on my shelves from a colleague a couple years ago on modern architecture. So that I won't say Downing single-handedly, but his book and the success of that book had a lot to do with moving Wiley into publication of textbooks and scientific books, and they just are celebrating their 202nd year in business, which is a pretty phenomenal literary landmark for them to reach. Downing died very suddenly at the age of 36 in a steamboat accident. At the time, he was involved in several projects, including a redesign of the mall in Washington, D.C. As a romantic revival architect, he envisioned L'Enfant's open space of axial views being transformed into a picturesque romantic park with winding paths and bosky groves and little places out of the way. Downing's death and then the Civil War made that not come true, which is probably okay, because we got Central Park later instead, which really picked up that idea. But there is a memorial to Downing right in front of the old Smithsonian building on the mall. It's not his burial place, it's just a memorial. And I'm kind of touched every time I go to Washington and see that. Downing did 3 books, The Treatise on Landscape Architecture, Cottage Residences, and The Architecture of Country Houses, the last one being published in 1850. Those books went into multiple editions, multiple printed versions. The last of the original editions, publications of Country Houses was 1873. That's 31 years after the original publication of the book. That's a remarkable longevity, and he was really known in the mid-19th century as the guy for romantic architecture, for improvement of the American landscape, and for being a good source. He's got a chatty, kind of 19th century, but a chatty writing style. You can actually read a Downing book and learn a lot, and he was well loved by his contemporaries. So here's just one example, though, how his work was really used. This is a house for George Vale. George Vale inherited a thriving iron business in Morris County, New Jersey, and he built a wonderful house. It's made of a local stone that's actually called pudding stone. It's very purple, a little odd, but Downing would have loved that. And you can see design number 5 from Cottage Residences is that house. Now, Mr. Vale was actually a member of Congress for a short time. When you get to be a member of Congress, your notes are kept in the Library of Congress. So be careful what you doodle. Because in his idle hours, I don't know if they were talking about, tariffs or immigration or what, but he starts doodling the house that he would like to build, and he designs a castle. And you can see the plan. He's going to have a library in one turret and the kitchen in another turret. Clearly, he's never been in a kitchen. And a museum to himself, who knows. And he's got all these little things. He's just doodling. This is marginalia in his congressional notes. How does a guy from New Jersey, even though he's a man of wealth and some sophistication, but he's never traveled, how does he know what a castle looks like? Honestly, how does he know? Partly how he knows is because as a landowner, he is reading agricultural magazines, specifically American Agriculturalist, which begins publishing in about 1842, the same year as Cottage Residences. American Agriculturalist is still in business and is the longest-lived serial publication in this country, and they write about how to raise pigs and how to take care of your chickens and how to build farmhouses. And some of those farmhouses were Downing-esque houses, and some of the magazine was devoted to sort of family stories, including romantic stories of castles and knights and long ago and far away. And you have actually, in a very popular press, the illustrations of castles. So what Vale ended up building was considerably less than a castle. I think maybe economic reality caught up to him, but it's a very interesting way to see the thought process of how one would use a pattern book. By the way, I'm busy clicking here. This castle house, this is Andrew Jackson Downing's own house in Newburgh, New York. He built himself a sort of a castle, which sadly was demolished in the 1920s. But here's a masthead from American Agriculturalist, this popular magazine that it has a wide circulation, not just to farmers, to anybody who is interested in the land and landscape, although very much to farmers as well. And the masthead, you'll see, has appropriated the Davis design, because we saw it in the McKim cottage, that is reworked for the Downing book and then taken probably without, I don't see any credit there, probably without too much copyright concern, directly into the American Agriculturalist. But part of what that does is it takes an architectural idea and spreads it to a very wide audience, gives people the idea that this is what buildings should look like. And then you say, well, maybe I should build something like that myself. So the image that I chose for this fabulous lecture series, and I thank them all again, thank Karen and Victoria and Lisa for inviting me to do this, is the frontispiece of a pattern book that came out in 1854 by Edward Shaw. Shaw is from the Boston area, and this was, in fact, the last pattern book ever to be published in Boston. No offense to Boston, you have a lovely football team, but other than that, there's the publishing center moved completely to New York. But this is such an interesting image because it shows us, first of all, the architect, builder, carpenter wearing a top hat. This is directly contemporary with Lincoln wearing a top hat. A top hat signifies you are somebody. You are the chief. You are the boss. You are the head of this particular group. So we have the architect with his papers there measuring out, and then his workmen who are probably vastly overdressed. They're just posing. But they are sawing wood, they have their big toolbox, and they are creating what certainly looks like a balloon frame building. Here is a finished villa in the Romantic Revival style. And this is a wonderful way of showing how this work is being done. There are designs on paper. Now, Shaw wants you to use his book. Shaw's book is actually pretty old-fashioned. It doesn't have much that's new or interesting in it other than this frontispiece, so we'll skip right over that. But there are plenty of other pattern books emerging in the later 1840s, 1850s that begin to talk about new ways of building. It's not just design that is changing, although that is very clear from classicism to the Romantic Revival styles. It's introducing newly mechanized, industrially produced materials, the 2x4, the cut nail, which are now widely available and cheap. It is not like mortise and tenoning a frame together and you need to inscribe Roman numerals to make it match. You can kind of bang up the pieces together, and the skill level that you need is very different than being the carpenter, joiner, to do the tenon making, so that it streamlines the process. It makes it possible to build more buildings faster, and in a growing America of the 19th century, that is a very important thing. And we begin to have pattern books that show exactly how that is done. I am so sorry for having a heavy trigger finger here. Balloon framing, as you know, is light framing. It's heavy framing, heavy timber framer. We looked at that in the first slide. Big timbers, heavy timbers, 9 inches, 11 inches, 12 inches in each dimension, and they are pegged, not nailed. Balloon framing are standard, machine cut, normal. Every piece is the same size, and you order up the 2x4s that you need to put something together. And here's just a wonderful image of another anonymous mid-19th century carpenter. Great pants. He has his toolkit, and again, a little top hat. He's an important guy in his builder's world. Now, I don't want to suggest that even still, when you see a pattern book design, or even published in a magazine such as The Horticulturalist, if you see a design like that, your ability to turn that into a standing three-dimensional house does rely on significant capacity, right? The labor is still involved there, the ideas of how to build, but it's also important to note that the ideas and the technology of balloon frame spread much more rapidly with the help of the printed page. These are just some examples of many of the kind of center-gabled Romantic Revival cottage that comes to populate places across the country, in no small part to that written word. Other kinds of pattern books introduce the larger gable front, center gable, farmhouse type. It introduces an idea that becomes very much part of the vernacular landscape across America. There was the case of William Ramlet, who was an American architect who trained in Philadelphia, and he thought that he should write a pattern book, and he did. It's very big, and therefore was very expensive. I think in modern parlance, we might say that William Ramlet overshared, and he gave designs of the exterior. He gave framing designs. He gave very clear estimates of this is how many days it's going to take. This is how much it's going to cost. He had images of details. He had text about how exactly you should do. You kind of wonder, like, well, why do I need to hire him as my architect? And you also wonder what kind of conversations might have had if you are deciding you would build this house, and your carpenter's bill is not the bill that he says it should be. I think there would be some very interesting conversations between client and builder at that point. Ramlet did not sell nearly as many books as Downing, and Downing doesn't talk about money, and he doesn't talk about specs. He lets you figure it out. But altogether, all of these mid-century authors produce these wonderful, fanciful additions to the vernacular landscape. Pattern book design or publication falls off kind of naturally through the Civil War. Only one book is published during the entire time of the war. It happens to be here in New York, Henry Hudson Holly's Country Seats book. But the seeds were planted in that, and immediately upon post-war times, there's now a flood of publications about building, including images that show a house like this, which becomes ubiquitous in American more urban settings, designed for narrow lots, in factory towns, in villages. The gable front porch, 3-bay wide frame house. It would be balloon framing, used to house. You could decorate it anyway. These have sort of kind of Gothic detailing on them, but very much it's not part of a vernacular tradition that comes from settlement groups or from the 18th century. This is something that's created in 19th century America and really picks up after the Civil War. A very peculiar detour, though. Orson Squire Fowler, also a New Yorker, publishes a book in 1848 is when he does the first draft, so to speak, and then it's really polished a couple years later. A Home for All. Orson Squire Fowler made most of his money and was most famous as a phrenologist, and he would read the bumps on your head and determine your character and your disposition. He also lectured on what was euphemistically described as marriage protocols, sex ed. But he was interested in a lot of things. Interesting dude. His octagon mode of building was cheap, convenient, and superior. He's got the answer to a way to build the most house for the least money. He also talks about doing it in gravel, the gravel wall, which is really a proto-concrete. That is probably the more interesting experiment that Fowler did, but actually it's the least part of his work that stuck. Now, there were octagon buildings traditionally in this country. We see octagons used for schoolhouses. We have an example in a law office, a teeny tiny building. There were some utilitarian buildings that used the idea of an octagon, being able to get light from all sides in a small structure. But Fowler said, gee, it would be great if we could have octagon houses. That would really enclose the most space for the least money. And no, it does not have pie-shaped rooms. It has more or less conventional rooms with a really novel idea of built-in closets, which is a good thing. That's actually his own house, which came and went in Fishkill, New York. But these octagon houses do exist, again, all over the United States. And when you see an octagon house, you have three-dimensional proof of the power of literature, architectural literature. This is so outside the norm of Western building tradition. This is not something that people tend to spontaneously invent on their own. These are absolutely, somebody had Fowler's book in their hand. Almost all the examples that survive, though, are wood or occasionally brick, as we see the one in Ohio. There are very few that use the full gravel wall construction method, which is an early version of a poured concrete. Another interesting shape that pattern books bring out is the L plan. Now we're like, yeah, how hard is that? That's not very complicated. Okay, I still have the $10 in my pocket. Every time I talk to people about pattern books, I say, show me a full-built house with an L plan from before 1840. And you probably can't do it. There are older houses that have additions, maybe, that may make it an L plan, but particularly a front-facing L as an initial build, as a part of the design construction, doesn't, again, happen until our friend Downing introduces it in 1842 in cottage residences. It's such a simple thing, but it changes the mass of the house, and it's very identifiable as a new way of thinking about the arrangement of a suburban house to have this projecting front L. So find me one, call me, $10 is yours. Otherwise, you're going to have to believe me that this is an innovation from the 1840s. And again, it takes off, it's promoted by pattern books, by agricultural magazines, our friend American Agriculturalist, and becomes a very normative part of the vernacular landscape in rural and urban places. As we near the end of the 19th century, the Scientific American, which is also one of the long-lived publications in the United States, opens up a centerfold builders and architects edition. It's sort of in the center of the regular edition of Scientific American for about 20 years, from 1882 to 1900. And in the pages of the builders edition, they showcase currently popular house designs, which at this point would be something we might call the Queen Anne style or the shingle style, very irregular, asymmetrical designs, but a little bit more, how shall I say this? They're not Gothic anymore. They're not Italianate. They're a little bit more modern in their outlook. The reason Scientific American is so excited about these houses is because they have things like plumbing and heating, and they very intentionally show the floor plans and tell you in great detail how many flues there are and where the furnace is and how much water is being flushed through the bathroom. Because these Queen Anne houses are really the first time you have domestic technology that we would recognize. They come with a kitchen, a bathroom, heating systems that we would say, yeah, okay, that's a little outmoded, but I can figure out how it works. It does what I expect. If you were to land in an 1850s kitchen or bathroom, you might not be as comfortable. It's not as familiar to us. So these are very modern, tech-filled houses from this time period. And Scientific American prints them in color. This is one of the early uses of color printing in a mass market publication. And so you get these wonderful images of the turreted, convoluted Queen Anne houses in the colors as they were meant to be seen. This design is credited to Frank Nichols of Bridgeport, Connecticut. He was actually the architectural editor for Scientific American, so he's plugging his own designs. In Scientific American, they'll show you a design, a nice, well-dressed family in a very nice grassy setting. This could be you could live here. This particular one, I've seen more real examples of that. So I know people must have written to Frank Nichols and said, gee, I love the house, I'd like to build that. So good for him. There were other pattern book authors, Pallisers, also from Connecticut, George Barber from Knoxville, Tennessee. These guys are some of the next step in building where they are commodifying design. This is not so much a pattern book as a catalog. Here are 42 different designs of houses. The designs cost $5. Write to us and we will send you a set of plans. The presumption is no longer that your builder will know how to build from a craft tradition that he has learned. He needs to see a set of plans, and depending on where this is built, there may actually be a building department that wants to see a set of plans, that wants to know for sure what's going to happen on a property. But these are commercially available plans, and they're very much mass market, and they're not so much innovative architecture as perpetuating a Queen Anne type of design, which was very much a builder's popular style. Those color plates in Scientific American reflect, in part, that there is paint available. I mean, how hard is that? But paint pre-mixed in a resealable can that can be shipped to you, and you can have a color chart and know exactly what color is coming to you in the can. That is actually a revolution all by itself, and we have a whole nother talk about that at a different time, but lots of beautiful colors from the 19th century. We have plumbing, and we have heating, and we have stoves, and we have sinks. Pattern books, architecture magazines, agriculture magazines, all of a sudden the advertising of stuff to put into houses, the stuff that makes it go, is very overwhelming in the 19th century and shows that these pre-industrial design looking houses are actually quite modern and reliant completely on industrial production to produce the parts and pieces that they need. Nobody's baluster is hand-carved in the 19th century. They come from a catalog. The Cooperative Building Plan Association billed itself as the largest architecture firm in the United States in the 1880s. Now, this is parallel with the time when McKim, Mead, and White were here in New York, running a reasonably sized firm, but the Cooperative Building Plan Association had a room full of architects, and you could write away to them. They advertised through a publication and said, look, we've got these great designs in the popular Queen Anne style, but if you don't like this, or you need a different orientation, or you want a bigger bedroom, or you want a different kitchen arrangement, we will do semi-custom architecture for you. Just write to us. So they are providing architectural services, but a very limited palette of things, but the kind of thing that would be loved by builder developers. And I just so happen to have an example of an entire neighborhood that clearly is built from the Schoppel pattern book. And it's interesting, when we started, we talked about the 150-year time gap between Palladio and the Ware edition of Palladio in English. Now we're talking about houses built in the same year as the design is published. So things are picking up speed. It's 1886, it's modern times, and I think that is a really remarkable progression. This house is shown in an old photograph. There was a slight modification. The real house got a porch that wrapped around. The drawing shows a different arrangement of the porch. So this is the kind of thing you would write to Schoppel and say, I'm really interested in design 306, but I'd like to take advantage of a view, I'd like to extend the porch, and they made it happen. The antidote to all that elaborate Queen Anne design is Gustav Stickley, who emerges at the turn of the century with his Craftsman magazine and promoting the ethos of craftsman architecture, simplicity, authenticity, relating to nature. One of the simplicity items that Stickley promotes is a house that he calls it here a farmhouse, but we would really describe it as a bungalow. The bungalow in the Craftsman magazine is a very gracious house with a very large center fireplace and living area. You could read about the bungalow in Stickley's magazine, but you might write to him and say, gee, I really like that. Could you send me the plans? He was not really in the business of selling these. It's more like the ideas of how wonderful they are. But Sears Roebuck, Montgomery Ward, Aladdin, a whole bunch of timber sellers get the idea this could work. And it is some of Stickley's intellectual ideas that inspire the kit house producers of the early 20th century, who now have taken domestic building from individual handmade architecture to a kit. You order the kit, you get the pieces, you put it together. This is the Crescent that Sears did, one of their most popular versions of a house, which is actually supposed to look colonial. But you got everything, and Sears was great at this, because if you needed the house, you needed the siding, you needed the framing, you needed the hardware, you needed the wallpaper, you needed the rugs, you needed the chairs inside. One order brings it all. And it did fill a need of a lot of housing relatively cheaply. The model collapsed during the Great Depression. Sears and some of the other companies did let you order on credit. People couldn't pay back the house, but they owned the land. And Sears finds themselves in the unfortunate possession. They sold a kit. Now you have a house on your land. They can't really do much about that. They can't get it back. They can't repossess. So they lost a whole lot of money. Said we're out of the house business. But it was an interesting model for a lot of housing, creating the most with the least. There we go. So I hope that this little romp through 2.5 centuries of American architecture showed how labor, literature, and landmarks have intersected over time through the wonder of pattern books. Thank you. if there are questions, we can have a question, but I'm aware that I'm the only thing between you and a drink, so we can talk informally later. But if you have a question you'd like to share with everybody, please stand up and give me a shout.
Hi, so we will be taking questions, but please wait until the microphone is given to you so we can capture it in the recording.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. Going back to one of the buildings you showed us in Philadelphia that was...
The Bank of Pennsylvania, the Greek
yes,
Revival, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Seemed like it took them 11 years to build it, and it only stood for 60 years.
Yeah.
Why? Just curious, do you know why?
The length of time to build it, I really can't speak, although I can guess. You know, it's a hard technology for the time and place. The demolition happens. Philadelphia is growing, and it was an old-fashioned building at that point. You know, it doesn't matter that we think it's beautiful. There are lots of beautiful things that were demolished. It served its function. Penn Station wasn't even that old when it was demolished. Yes, sir.
Yeah, as an engineer responsible for code enforcement, licensed in New York and New Jersey.
Okay.
This is my first experience in this room or with this group as part of the New York Landmarks Commission. So I have to say, I find it very enlightening and encouraging to know that there was a time in this country where construction workers knew how to read Roman numerals. But I was wondering very briefly if you could talk specifically in New Jersey about your work as a preservation consultant, just by way of example with the kits. Seagirt, New Jersey. They have about 30 teardowns a year, as opposed to a neighborhood like, or a town like Cape May. Could you enlighten a little bit as to why some places on the Jersey Shore just want to tear down, you know, some of this magnificent work, and others are very good about preservation?
All politics is local. Does that help? Some communities, Cape May, most famously, the entire city of Cape May is a regulated historic district because they recognize that their economic life comes from people interested in seeing a Victorian seaside resort. And they figured out that not only is it beautiful, but it directly connects to their economic health. Seagirt, I don't know, but I'm guessing doesn't have a regulated historic district, which is an overlay to zoning that would regulate what happens to the buildings. And that, of course, is a choice that towns make. I would argue that every town has something worth preserving, but not every town recognizes or has an idea that it is of value to them in some way. So Seagirt may choose not to have a historic district, and if that's their choice, it's very, very hard in the absence of that, other than moral suasion, to get people to preserve older buildings. You're right that there are very distinct personalities between communities, and a place like Wildwood, New Jersey, I don't mean to go far afield, but is in the 1950s tore down a lot of their surviving Victorian hotels and built a lot of modern motels because they perceived that's what people needed. Now the motel district, the doo-wop district as it's called in Wildwood, is now a historic district because it's a fabulous collection of 1950s motels. They also have a historic district. They're preserving something different than Cape May, so it's nice to have that change. So we can maybe hope that Seagirt will build some fabulous buildings right now and have a historic district in 50 years that lets us see early 21st century seaside development. How's that?
Thank you for a brilliant talk, and I hope conversations like this help foster more appreciation of historic districts in areas like Seagirt. But I was wondering, one thing that I was struck by was you were speaking about pre-mixed paints becoming more widely available in the 1890s, corresponding to the new popularity of Queen Anne, and of course, Queen Anne was highly polychromatic.
Yes.
So could you comment in that specific case, the extent to which the new paints would have affected its adoption in Queen Anne houses? And can you speak in general on how the popularity of individual books helped to influence or guide the popularity of styles that were featured in those books as opposed to other styles that might have been developing at the same time?
The chicken and egg problem remains. You know, were houses painted more vibrantly because more colors were available, or did more colors get created because there was a demand from the style? I will say very early Queen Anne's are not generally as polychromatic, and there's more of a shingled and darker tonality, and the colors become brighter and more varied as time goes on. The marketing of paint becomes more vigorous. So I'm not prepared to answer which one is first, but they are certainly very closely linked in tandem, and advertising materials from paint companies are a wonderful resource for identifying style and color. As to which pattern books had the most influence, some of that is reflected in the talk I gave you, where I can you know, I'm a lunatic when I'm out in the world driving around or walking around, because I'm like, have I seen that before? Is that in that book? Do I know? You know, you just continually play this sort of visual memory game. The ones that you see bunches of, the Scientific American design that I recognize multiple ones around the region, that clearly has more influence in the world I inhabit. Now I know I live in a very parochial world of New Jersey, New York, and sometimes I get to Pennsylvania and Connecticut. If I did this, would my answers be different if I were in Ohio or Texas or Washington State? Probably, because it depends what books would be traveling from where they're mostly published in New York or Philadelphia out there. I do know, by the way, that Downing's works were picked up by the U.S. Army, and they have Army bases on the West Coast, including in Washington and Oregon, that use Downing cottages as officers' housing, and they just directly said, oh, this is a great design, we'll use that out there. We know that there's some books that are rare. Certainly if a book is published and goes to multiple editions, the way Downing's did, the way some of Sloane's books did, it must be popular, right? The publisher would not bother doing that if nobody's buying the books. Our oversharing William Ramlet, who gives you every single direction you could possibly want, he doesn't really sell that many books. It's one and done. So you kind of get a sense from the number of editions, but some of it is just the real world and the real world that you live in and how many of these you see. So that's the fun of my lifetime of exploring these, how many you see.
Last question.
Ooh. Sorry, we'll talk later.
Great talk. Thank you very much. Wondered, can you briefly talk about the formalization of architectural education in this country? I know it was pattern books were at the core of it, and that people like Ethiel Town had extraordinary libraries, which they were generous in lending and letting people consult. But at some point, you went from buying your own books or having access to your master's books to having buildings like this and university programs. When did all that begin?
The first American architecture school is MIT, and that's, help me out, kids, 1867, I believe. And then it's Cornell, Penn, Columbia through the 1880s. So this talk reflects my bias and interest in more vernacular architecture. There's a whole parallel universe almost of formal architectural education and high-style buildings.
Trying to borrow money to pay off the debt and taxes on his property while he was president-elect.
But anyway,
So
you're
that
right.
is
You're
exactly
right
the guy,
that
rolling around.
the architectural education is part of this story in that when you stop the master-apprentice system for learning how to do Roman numerals and heavy timber framing, there's a process working through where people are reading books, and then somebody says, there's so much out there we need to learn. We need a more formal process, and these self-taught architects are not capable of doing some of the more sophisticated buildings. So there is a divergence between the vernacular and the high-style work, and that's good of you to pick up, and that's a whole nother lecture. Invite me back.
Janet, before you walk away, first of all, I want to express our appreciation for your wonderful, eloquent tour of domestic American architecture exactly, and for your no one has ever done that before. No one has ever fused those three subjects in such a completely perfect way. So thank you very much. We so appreciate you being part of the Landmark Lecture Series, and we know how much work compiling a lecture like this, so thank you very much. We would like to make a presentation to you, and to do so is our Executive Director, Victoria Dengel.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. And I have to say, it's so hard to follow Karen Taylor and her comments because they're always just perfect. So I'll just say, in this case, ditto, because it was extra perfect. So thank you. Thank you. So on behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, founded 1785, we express our gratitude to Janet W. Foster, architectural historian and historic preservation consultant, for pattern books and 19th century American building, for her participation in the General Society Labor, Literature, and Landmark Lecture Series. So thank you so much.
How very kind.
Thank you. And because over this past hour, we've grown to like you a lot, so we've made you a lifetime member of the library. There you go.
Actually do own a couple of pattern books, so.